son la Pata Negra, con la orquesta de Pablo Valenzuela. Cilindro Edison.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. True Leverett, and I would like to welcome all of you and thank you for attending this first event in the Justice Sessions, which will be a year-long series of bi-weekly meetings on race and civil rights in Jacksonville's past and present in order that we shape a more just future. This series has been the brainchild of Dr. Keith Cartwright, who is a professor of English in the English department at UNF and chair of the English department as well. And the Justice Sessions have been organized by a group of people and sponsored and presented by a number of entities at the university, in particular the departments of English, History, Languages, Literatures, and Cultures, Political Science and Public Administration, the Coggin College of Business, the College of Arts and Sciences, and the Digital Humanities Institute. So as we know very clearly right now, our nation as a whole is confronting injustice. And so we're seeing that very clearly right now with events that have happened in Kenosha over the past few days. And these injustices that we're confronting are calling us to face the limiting legacies of our national and our regional history, and how that history continues to inform us and our lives in this present moment. This being the eve of the 60th anniversary of Axe Handle Saturday here in Jacksonville, Florida, we are fortunate and very grateful to have Mr. Rodney Hurst, author and civil rights activist, in conversation with us today. So I want to personally thank him for sharing his time with us. And Mr. Hurst will be introduced by Dr. Chris Jansen. So I will introduce Dr. Jansen now for everyone. Dr. Jansen, sorry?
So thank you, True.
Sure. Dr. Jansen, let me introduce you. Sorry, I've got a bio to share. Dr. Jansen is an associate professor and the director of the UNF Center for Urban Education and Policy. He has authored over 20 journal articles and book chapters on topics related to educator preparation, community engaged practices, and the role academics can play as activists. In addition to his work through UNF and through the center, Dr. Jansen works alongside national and local community educators, scholars, and organizers in order to develop democratic processes with community members to develop and facilitate what are called community learning exchanges, CLEs. These are interorganizational, multicultural, and multi-generational convenings designed to strengthen the social and political fabric of communities through individual and collective strengths, gifts, and assets. Dr. Jansen has co-authored a book on this CLE approach titled Reframing Community Partnerships in Education, Uniting the Power of Place and the Wisdom of People. So I would like to welcome Dr. Jansen and thank him for co-moderating today's session. Before turning the session over to him though, I should announce that we will have a Q&A portion toward the end of the event. So we're asking everyone to drop any questions that they have into the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. questions should be there in that Q&A box rather than in the chat box. So we'd appreciate that just for organization's sake and efficiency. Thank you. And Dr. Jansen, it's all yours.
Thank you, Drew. Not used to such lengthy introductions. I appreciate that. And I also am very thankful for this Justice series that's been put together by this collaborative led by Dr. Keith Cartwright and shepherded this session, certainly by Dr. Laura Heffernan. It's my deep pleasure, as always, to introduce my friend and mentor, Mr. Rodney Hurst. So Rodney, is very busy, the past number of months, because as Drew mentioned, tomorrow is the 60th anniversary of Axe Handle Saturday. The story, though, to us, not only as a center, but through other community work that we've engaged in together, holds so much promise for informing, especially me as an educator of educators, for informing how we can better envision how teachers and public school educators of all kinds can really refocus their practices in ways that are anti-racist. So anti-racist education was going on long before that term evolved for it. And I think it was possibly best embodied by a man that we'll also honor and discuss today, and that was Mr. Rutledge Pearson, the 8th grade social studies teacher at Isaiah Blocker Junior High, who was himself a mentor and a friend to Rodney Hurst. So I think those two parts, these two men, to me, represent the possibility of what happens when youth and adults are in partnership with each other. I think it really speaks to the power of possibility when hope is not just something that is contained in our dispositions, but people work and act toward it. So as Drew mentioned, white supremacist ideology is alive and well, unfortunately, today. So we see it in responses to the protests against racism last night in Kenosha. We see it when we look at the underrepresentation of students of color and faculty of color in our own university. We see it in unfair housing systems. And what I've always appreciated and continue to learn from is what happens when people work together, support each other's moral courage, and act in ways to disrupt those inequitable, unjust, racist systems. So my teacher in helping me understand how these things operate is Mr. Rodney Hurst. Rodney, as mentioned, is the author of 3 outstanding books. It Was Never About a Hot Dog and a Coke, chronicling his experiences leading up to and through the 1960 lunch counter sit-ins. The next one, Unless We Tell It, Never Gets Told, which really traces not only local Black historical figures, but also is an analysis of racism in the United States. And finally, a plug, his upcoming book, which he co-authored with my other friend in this work, Dr. Rudy Jameson, Never Forget Who You Are, Conversations About Racism and Identity Development. So without further ado, Rodney, thank you for once again generously giving your time.
Thank you, Chris. It's my pleasure. Thank you, Laura. Thank you for those who are listening to the conversations we will have today as we talk about civil rights, as we talk about what happened during that time, and as we talk about what we need to do or can do in developing the kind of relationships that we need for dealing with racism and inequities. So let me get this started for you, and then we'll move on.
The civil rights movement in the late 50s and the early 60s is a history painted on the human canvas of courage. As retail stores that opened their doors to the public, Woolworth, W.T. Grant, Coen Brothers, and other downtown stores in Jacksonville, Florida, and throughout the country would accept your money at one counter, but would deny you service at another. Their white lunch counters were visible vestiges of segregation and were an open daily reminder of the obscene and insulting treatment of blacks. Mr. Rutledge Henry Pearson, an American history school teacher and the advisor to the Jacksonville, Florida Youth Council, NAACP, imparted one basic philosophy to his students and youth council members. Freedom is not free. If it is worth having, it is worth making a sacrifice and fighting the good fight. Disregarding physical peril, members of the Jacksonville Youth Council NAACP made the decision to confront the city's segregated policies and its accompanying Jim Crow laws. They simply said, enough is enough. It was never about a hot dog and a Coke recounts the 1960 sit-in demonstrations, which sought to protest segregation peacefully, and Jacksonville's response of vicious violence. More than 200 whites with axe handles and baseball bats attacked the demonstrators in yet another chapter of the historical testimony of how some preferred to handle the racial situation in Jacksonville. The press called it Axe Handle Saturday. Blacks in the 50s and early 60s were not free. They endured racism, discrimination, pain, and suffering in the fight for civil rights. Yet, they fought on the courage of their convictions, knowing God was on their side. They endeavored to leave a legacy and heritage of which we can all be proud. We have an obligation to today's generation to tell our story. Regardless of what you have seen or heard about sit-in demonstrations, it was never about eating a hot dog and drinking a Coke. It was always about human dignity and respect. The struggle continues.
Hopefully everyone got a chance to hear that okay. Did everyone get a chance to hear and see that okay?
Vividly. It was great audio.
Very good. Okay, good, good. One of the things that we will start talking about now is the concept of what happens in a civil rights movement and what happened during these 65 years ago. And I say 65 years ago, so I'm starting with my enrolling in Mr. Pearson's 8th grade American history class in 1955. Mr. Pearson taught 8th grade American history at Isaiah Blocker. Isaiah Blocker was one of the 2 Negro junior high schools in this Negro division of the Duval County public school system. Duval County had 2 Negro junior high schools then, and 3 later 4 high schools in each of the geographical locations of Jacksonville, all designed and located to forestall integration. The first day in Mr. Pearson's class, he showed us the copy of the book that was approved for this Negro 8th grade American history class. This book that only included the names of George Washington Carver and Booker T. Washington as if they were the only blacks to make salient contributions to American history. And after telling us about the book, what the book entailed, the authors and the publishers of the book, Mr. Pearson would slam the book down on the desk and he would tell us, leave it home. Mr. Pearson did not teach us American history from a slanted and racist viewpoint of white textbook authors and white historians. He wanted us to understand the salient contributions of Blacks to American society, Blacks who helped to develop this country. We wrote letters to Thurgood Marshall and Constance Baker Motley, to Althea Gibson, to Jackie Robinson, to John Hope Franklin while we were in this class. We did book reports on Blacks who impacted this country and the world. When we would get those book reports back, when we would get the letters, the replies to the letters back, we had to write up that reply. And when we did book reports, we had to do those book reports on 2 to 3 pages of typewritten copy. No printers, no computers, and many of us did not know how to type. But we got those reports typed, and our response to the letters and our interpretation from those letters were all typed up. All in Mr. Pearson saying to us that you are equals, you are not inferior. Mr. Pearson said something else in the class, and he said it regularly. He said, freedom is not free if you are not a part of the solution, then you are a part of the problem. And he encouraged us to join the Youth Council NAACP. This is 1955. A Black male school teacher stands up telling his class to join the NAACP and do something about the problems in this country by being a part of the solution to those problems. I joined the Youth Council NAACP when I was 11. I was 11 in Mr. Pearson's class, so I joined at his invitation. I started school when I was 5 and I got skipped. And my pastor would say, favor ain't fair. And for those of you who don't know what that means, then you need to ask somebody. When we would go to youth council meetings, for those of us that took 8th grade American history and 9th grade civics from Mr. Pearson, it was an extension of his classes. But for those students who were hearing from Mr. Pearson for the first time, it opened up a vista to them understanding what being Black or a Negro in this country at that time meant, in understanding the advancements made by people who look like us. The difference was we had to understand how to be a part of the solution. And we learned that by being a part of Mr. Pearson's class and being a part of what happened in youth council meetings. In Jacksonville, at the Florida Times Union, they had a section called News for and About the Colored People of Jacksonville. This was a section in the Florida Times Union at the end of the paper, behind the classified ads, behind the want ads, behind the used car ads, behind the new car ads. And this was where the Black news about Black folk or colored people at that time was housed in the local newspaper. Blacks never made it into the main part of the Florida Times Union. We were always in news for and about the colored people of Jacksonville. It did not make any difference what your accomplishments were, what you had achieved. You were always relegated to news for and about the colored people of Jacksonville in the local newspaper, which shows you that not only was segregation physical, but it was also mental and psychological. Segregation and racism was part of the dehumanizing process for Black folk in this country, which is why I say you can never start talking to young Black students too early about racism. You're looking at Himmon Park. You're standing on the Lara Street side or the east side of Himmon Park looking west. At the lower left in the background, you see J.C. Penney's up at the top of the building. In that building to the left, you see F.W. Woolworth, which was a department store. In the back of the building, you see the Robert Meyer Hotel. And in the center of the park, in the center of Himmon Park, you had the statue to the Confederate soldier. When the sit-ins began in February of 1960 in Greensboro, North Carolina, by 4 students from North Carolina A&T, they were members of the NAACP college chapter at North Carolina A&T. Most of the members of the youth council in Jacksonville were in high school. We had some young adults, but most of us were in high school. So when we started planning for that first sit-in, we did not have the options of sitting in during the week because we were still in school. And we were still living in our parents' houses. But during that summer, when we were out of school, we started making plans for our sit-ins in Jacksonville. I've been president of the Youth Council NAACP at age 15 and led the sit-ins in 1960, 2 months after I had graduated from high school. When you would go downtown to shop, Jacksonville had a number of department stores which were like anchor stores in shopping centers. There were no shopping centers at this time. And when you would go into a store, and the stores would encourage you as a Black shopper to come in and shop, but they wanted you to spend your money only where they wanted you to spend your money. So we could shop all over the store, but you could not go to that lunch counter that had the invisible sign that said whites only. You could pass by the dehumanizing signs that said colored water and white water. You can pass by the colored men, colored women, white men, white women bathrooms. This system of racism that said separate but equal, this segregation way of life in the South. So when we walked into those department stores, even as young people, to spend money and to have our money accepted at one counter and not at another was insulting, not only as a shopper, but insulting as a person whose hue of skin was Black. And on August 13th, we left the Laura Street Presbyterian Church Youth Center, which was where Mr. Pearson worshiped. Laura Street Presbyterian Church Youth Center was on Laura Street in between State and Union in downtown Jacksonville and just a few blocks from the middle of downtown. So on that first Saturday, we left in 2s and 3s. We did not leave marching downtown. We did not want anyone to know that we were coming, first of all. So we walked into Woolworth from whatever direction, and we always went to another counter to purchase something first. Just to show that we had shopped in the store and we had purchased something, and now we are going over to another counter to spend our money to purchase something. And in this instance, it would be food. So there was no reason why Woolworth or Grant or McCrory's or Cohen Brothers, where City Hall is now, or Crest or Walgreens, all stores that had white lunch counters, there would be no reason on the surface for you to accept my money in other counters, and then when I went over to get something to eat, you would say no. When Alton Yates and Marjorie Meeks and I first went to the white lunch counter at Woolworth on this Saturday in August, the white waitress said to us in a relatively loud voice, "You can't sit here. The colored lunch counter is in the back." That's where the coloreds go to eat. And we said to the waitress that we wanted to be served. Later, the manager of Woolworth, James Word, came out and he read a statement to us. And then he decided, or the decision or the policy of the store was to close the lunch counter, which is what he did. Woolworth had the largest lunch counter in downtown Jacksonville. They had 84 seats. And we knew they had 84 seats because we researched to find out how many seats there were in all of the white lunch counters in downtown Jacksonville, so we would make sure that when we started the demonstrations, we would have enough sit-inners, enough youth council members to make sure if the lunch counter was totally vacant that we could sit in all the seats. So what you're seeing in this PowerPoint on this slide is the aftermath of that first sit-in when they closed the lunch counter. You see the press talking to Alton Yates with the glasses on. I'm right across Alton in the white short sleeve shirt. The whites that you see in the picture, in the middle of the picture, are from the media, from the Florida Times Union and one person from Channel 12, the NBC affiliate at that time. The black gentleman almost in the middle of the picture with glasses on with the white shirt was Eric Simpson. He was the editor of the Florida Star. The local newspaper, the Times Union, Channel 4 and Channel 12 blacked out all news about the sit-in demonstrations, starting with this first one. And whites stood behind us yelling the racial epithets of the day because by Woolworth closing the lunch counter, they blamed that on us, Black folk, victims, and also those who are accused of perpetrating the crime. So nigger and jungle bunny and go back to Africa and niggers ain't acting like colored people for NAACP were some of the racial epithets and comments and words that we heard then, which are the same words we hear today. But they were upset because they could not get to their fresh lunches at Woolworth. We had a white student to join us. His name was Richard Parker. And when Richard Parker sat in with us at Woolworth, then whites had figured it out. They knew that their good colored citizens would not do anything to upset the racial harmony in Jacksonville. There had to be something else that caused this, and because Richard Parker sat in with us as a white person, then they figured that Richard Parker was the leader of the sit-ins, and Richard Parker was agitating the coloreds to do these things to upset the racial harmony in Jacksonville. They were building the Florida National Bank building, which is where the Ed Ball building is now. And there were a number of construction workers, obviously, working on the Florida National Bank building. And the day that Parker set in, that same day, there were construction workers who came in and stood behind Parker at the lunch counter. There were some black teenagers in Woolworth that day looking on, seeing what was happening with the sit-ins. They were not part of the youth council. They were not members of the youth council. They were not a part of the demonstrations. But sensing what had happened, they walked over to the lunch counter, and I told Parker to go with them because I needed them to get him out of Woolworth, because the white construction workers that came in and stood behind Parker were not there in support of Parker being there. I am convinced, as are other members of the youth council, that they were there to grab Parker off of that lunch counter seat. So those black students walked, those black teenagers walked, those black young people walked Richard Parker out of Woolworth to the black business district, which was about 4 or 5 blocks away, and to his safety. On August 27th, 1960, Mr. Pearson got a call that said there are some strange goings on in Himmel Park. Mr. Pearson drove to Himmel Park, and he saw white men in Confederate uniforms. He saw other white men with Confederate flags taped to axe handles. And he and Dr. Arnett Gerardo, who went with him, Dr. Gerardo was a dental student. On one corner of Hemming Park, there was a van type, station wagon type vehicle parked. Had a sign that said free axe handles, and there were bundles of free axe handles in the shrubbery then at that corner of Hogan and Duval Street at Hemming Park. You don't understand the heft of an axe handle until you really get a chance to see it and feel it. And in my book, I included examples of axe handles which have the heft of a baseball bat and very convenient handles to grab and to swing when necessary. So on this Saturday morning, 2 weeks after we had started the first demonstration, we met at Laura Street Presbyterian Church Youth Center for our youth council meeting before we went on the sit-ins. I went to the sit-ins or conducted the sit-ins. And we prayed and we sang our freedom songs, our civil rights songs like we usually do. And Mr. Pearson and Dr. Gerardo reported to us what they saw that morning. And Mr. Pearson said something could happen today. And if you don't want to sit in, he would understand. But we said we would sit in. We had a healthy fear that something could happen. But we also had determined courage enough to still want to be a part of the solution and not a continuing part of the problem. So we went to sit in that day at W.T. Grant on the corner of Adams and Main Street the way we did at any other sit-in. And they closed the lunch counter, and we would always sit a little bit longer just to make sure the stores did not turn around and open the counter back up to start serving those fresh lunches, which they could not serve while the lunch counters were closed. So if they wanted to indulge and have, let racism be a part of the order of the day, we wanted to make that racism as expensive as possible by at the very least causing them to have to throw away the fresh sandwiches that they could not sell hours later because now those sandwiches were stale. So we sat for a while. When we left Grants and turned onto Adams Street, we saw a horde of 200 whites coming down the street with axe handles and baseball bats. It was a surreal scene, and even though your mind takes that panoramic view as to what was happening at that time, you still could not focus on and believe what you were seeing because you were able to see in the distance that these men were swinging something and they were hitting someone. And finally, when you focused on what it was, then you understood these were white men with bats and axe handles in their hands, swinging on black persons downtown and then swinging on white persons who sought to help that black person. But they were coming toward us. We were the target of what they were coming down that street for. Stores started locking the doors. If you were in those stores, you stayed in. If you were outside of those stores, you could not get in, and you needed to find another place of refuge and sanctuary from being harmed. There were no policemen downtown during that day or during the 2 weeks of our sitting in. There was no protect and serve downtown from August 13 to August 27. So we did what we could do to protect the young ladies who were sitting in with us. And then you ran for your safety. We were children. Most of the sit-inners that day were still in their teens. Again, I was 16 and had just graduated from high school 2 weeks prior, 2 months prior to this date. But this was how racists, white racists in the South responded to civil rights demonstrations and the civil rights movement. Understand that this country has a constitution and a declaration of independence. And the Constitution says we the people, and the Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal. So as American citizens, we were we the people, and we were part of those men created equal. But then it would dawn on you when you understood how this country was formed and developed and how it was created on a racist Christian ethic, where they had to get around the biblical teachings and the teachings of Jesus Christ, if you are a Christian, to consider those persons whose skin was black as property or chattel. And what we were seeing at that time, some 95 years after the end of the war between the United States of America and an enemy government called the Confederacy, we were still seeing the spillover of blacks not being considered as humans, wherein today we continue to see blacks not considered as humans. And it all comes together based on how Mr. Pearson taught us in his classes and what we discussed in youth council meetings. When you understand that after we were considered property and not humans, every religious denomination in this country owned slaves. In the 1830s, Georgetown College, now Georgetown University, founded by the Jesuit priests. Jesuit means son of Jesus. So in the 1830s, Georgetown College got in trouble keeping its doors open. And these Catholic priests sold 272 of their slaves, realizing $115,000, $6 million in today's money. So the obvious question is, why did Catholic priests own slaves? 1845, Southern Baptists met in Augusta, Georgia, and they formed the Southern Baptist Convention for the express purpose of supporting slavery. So when religions embrace the concept that you are not human based on the color of your skin, and they have maintained that philosophy and ideology since the founding of this country. And since we have only been out of bondage, out of being enslaved persons for a little over a century, it is easy to see why racism, which was birthed out of slavery, is still prevalent in this country today. Charlie Griffin was walking downtown that day shopping. This was end of August, getting ready to go back to school. He was doing shopping. There were no shopping centers, and everyone came downtown to shop. And he was beaten by 4 or 5 whites with axe handles and baseball bats. And this is his picture in Life magazine. Now, the press blacked out all news about the sit-ins, the Times Union and the 2 television stations, Channel 4 and Channel 12 at that time, CBS affiliate, NBC affiliate. So you cannot go to those stations or to the newspaper to do any research on what was happening then with the byline of their reporters. Everything that you are seeing today in Jacksonville about the sit-ins then have come from the commemorations that we have had over the years, with major commemorations every 10 years. And from my book, It Was Never About a Hot Dog and a Coke, which started off as my personal account, but because there is no additional information and because I corroborated and documented everything I put in the book, even though it is something that I revisit every day, my book has become a history book because there are things in the book that you won't find anywhere else. This is a headline in the Pittsburgh Courier, a national black newspaper that had different extensions and offices in different states. This was their headline the week after Axe Handle Saturday. These were the statistics at that time. If you check with the FBI for this time period for the Axe Handle Saturday and the 1960 sit-in riots, there were 103 persons hurt and 3 persons killed. We had our resident racist. This is Warren Folks picketing City Hall with his Confederate flag and with his very demonstrative sign, illustrative sign that says, "We hate niggers." Hayden Burns was the mayor of Jacksonville. He later became governor of Florida. And before Axe Handle Saturday, before we started the sit-ins, we asked him to appoint a biracial committee to look at some of the problems that the black community had with the city of Jacksonville and city government And he said that biracial meant integration. And since he was a segregationist, he would not appoint or do anything that pertained to integration. This is another article from the Pittsburgh Courier written by the late Tres Van Anderson, who was a noted Black journalist. And in interviewing Earl Johnson, who was the NAACP attorney, Attorney Johnson laid it out that Hayden Burns could have stopped this riot and chose not to do so. 20 years ago, I met an FBI informant who was with the Klan during this time. And he wrote up the report, gave it to his handler. His handler, in turn, informed other agencies, but took that report and put it on the desk of the sheriff of Jacksonville at that time. Jacksonville had a police department. The county had a sheriff's department. Dale Carson, who was the sheriff, was a former FBI agent. So this FBI handler, who was an FBI agent for the FBI informant, took the report and put it on Dale Carson's desk to only have that report intercepted by one of Dale Carson's lieutenants, who was a member of the Klan, as we later found out. We also found out from the FBI informant that the National Guard was on standby in St. Augustine and at Camp Blanding, that the Ku Klux Klan had met in a downtown restaurant, a downtown hotel rather, the Mayflower Hotel, the week prior to Axe Handle Saturday, as they planned to start a race war in Jacksonville. So White Jacksonville knew that something was going to happen. And they let it happen anyway. This is also another article that's in my book that talks about this guiding hand by this smooth, highly intelligent, articulate young president of the NAACP Youth Council named Rodney Hurst. And as I tell folk, this was my book. I could put whatever I wanted to put in my book. This article from the Pittsburgh Courier. But in the lower part of this article, it talks about how these Black youths protected their white friend from being attacked by these construction workers. The day after Axe Handle Saturday, Richard Parker was arrested at a white lunch counter, charged with vagrancy and inciting to riot. He had on the suit and the tie, he had $30 in his pocket. He was in a white restaurant. He was staying at a white hotel in Jacksonville. So we knew that, and later on, as we determined that even though we saw no police during the sit-ins, there were police there in plain clothes who were taking our pictures. They took Parker's picture, which was why they were able to arrest him. Parker was given 90 days for the trumped up charges of inciting to riot and vagrancy. He was put in the same cell of some of the whites who were arrested the day before, and the jailers told those whites in this segregated cell that this was one of those nigger-loving racial agitators, and they promptly proceeded to break his jaw in 3 or 4 places and dislocate his shoulder. So I'm going to stop there. And I'm going to leave you with what happened on that day and not move to what happened afterwards. And at the same time, I want to let you know that tomorrow, when we celebrate the 60th anniversary of Axe Handle Saturday, when we commemorate the 60th anniversary of Axe Handle Saturday, We are commemorating what happened because a lot of folk in Jacksonville do not know the colleges and universities don't teach civil rights history, not about Jacksonville. The school system does not teach civil rights history, not about Jacksonville. They do not teach about what happened in Jacksonville. And what happened in Jacksonville is a part of the civil rights history of this city, state, and this country. And yet we don't know. It's just like American history. I consider American history incomplete, dishonest, and racist. And that's a full subject for another conversation. But we never thought, white folk never thought, that these things happen in this land of sunshine, beaches, and palm trees, but it did. And when you understand the history of Jacksonville, where Jacksonville was with other cities, and how those other cities have moved beyond Jacksonville, and how Jacksonville's leadership then and now still keep their head in the sand. And I say every time I talk about Jacksonville, that you cannot include the word progressive and Jacksonville in the same sentence. So with that, I will pause. I thank you for listening. I thank you for hearing this part of the story. And I'll entertain whatever questions anyone might have.
So the first question in the Q&A box is from Tamitha Kane, and it says, "Thank you so much for this presentation. Can you elaborate on your statement regarding white Jacksonville knowing what was going to happen and letting it happen? Thank you."
When the FBI informant reported, even though they gave a written report to the sheriff, the fact that they had National Guard on standby in St. Augustine and at Camp Blanding, they knew what was going to happen. Police did not come to downtown Jacksonville until after some blacks from the black business district started making their way downtown, when the word got out that there was a racial riot and the youth council was being attacked. So they left Ashley Street 4 or 5 blocks away going downtown. And when they got to downtown, then police came from everywhere to shut off downtown. They were somewhere massed so they could come to downtown. But for whatever reason, they decided they did not want to show themselves the day that they knew that the Klan was going to attack the sit-in demonstrators in downtown Jacksonville and any other blacks for that matter. So white Jacksonville knew what was going to happen that day.
And what ended up happening to Richard Parker?
I get that question quite a bit, and unfortunately, I cannot answer that. We were told that Parker was killed in Mississippi. I have not confirmed that. I do know he was a junior at Florida State. He applied for readmission or for his senior year at Florida State, and they denied his application. They did not officially, as far as their records is concerned, disclose a reason why they denied him, but he was a student in good standing when he left Florida State, not owing any fees or any money to the college, but they denied him. But I don't know what happened to Parker.
Can you elaborate a little more on Jacksonville leadership continuing to keep their heads in the sand regarding civil rights and race relations?
Well, we see it all around us. I was involved in an effort to help change the name of Nathan Bedford Forrest. Nathan Bedford Forrest was a slave trader He was a Fort Pillow butcher. He was a treasonous criminal and anarchist that sought to overthrow the United States of America as a general in the army of an enemy government called the Confederacy, comprised of those states that seceded from the United States of America to create this enemy government to fight the United States of America, to overthrow the United States of America, to maintain slavery. Nathan Bedford Forrest was also the Fort Pillow butcher when he led his men in the massacre of 300 Negro at the time, soldiers and women and children, under a flag of surrender at Fort Pillow. And in his writings, he said he wanted to make sure that Northerners knew that Negro soldiers were not the equal of Southerners. Nathan Bedford Forrest was also the first imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan and was one of the founders of the Ku Klux Klan. But we've got other schools named after treasonous anarchist criminals. The only reason why the Confederacy and those persons that sought to overthrow this country were not prosecuted by this country was after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated and Andrew Johnson became president, he gave a blanket amnesty to Jefferson Davis and his cabinet, to Robert E. Lee and his generals and his soldiers in the Confederacy. They all should have been tried and disciplined, hanged and or shot as treasonous, and they were not. And we honor them by naming schools after them, by having monuments to them. And these were people who sought to overthrow this country. And in Jacksonville, we just changed the name of Nathan Bedford Forrest in 2013, and the students voted to do that. We've got a statue in downtown of Andrew Jackson, who is responsible for killing more Native Indians than any other person in the history of this country. So you can only ignore so many things so long when it comes to being an actual criminal and a treasonous and someone that sought to overthrow this country. There was no war between the North and the South. It was a war between an enemy government called the Confederacy and the United States of America. And the Confederacy lost.
And how do you think Jacksonville can work today to become more of a progressive and anti-racist city?
Jacksonville has a way to go. As an upper tier city, Jacksonville is one of only 32 cities with an NFL team. So you would think that Jacksonville would be sophisticated enough to deal with a number of its problems, and it has not. You would think that Jacksonville would understand some of the things it needs to do to be an inclusive city, and it has not. Jacksonville does not teach Black history, which is a cornerstone. Disrespect is a cornerstone of racism. And not understanding an inclusive history shows how much whites disrespect Blacks in the educational arena. And not just in high schools, but in colleges and universities also. So if Jacksonville is going to make any strides at all, it has to understand that they need to move from the 50s and 60s into the 21st century to make sure Jacksonville is a place for all of its citizens, inclusive of the contributions made by Black folk also.
Just Going back to your account of what happened that day, saying that you all were suspicious that something could have happened that day and everyone was praying and everyone was so worried, how did you persevere through that sea of emotions and decide to continue to sit in and continue to stand up even when y'all were terrified?
Well, we were not necessarily terrified. We called it a healthy fear. There might have been some persons who were terrified, but still, you cannot allow what might happen to stop you from doing what needs to happen. So we were not influenced by what might have happened. If I had to do it again, I would do the same thing, notwithstanding the fact that I know that we are going to be attacked. And even though that sounds somewhat corny and clicheist, but there is a sacrifice involved in fighting against racism in this country. And many times it is a sacrifice that a lot of Black folk don't want to make. When you talk to people in the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King and Medgar Evers and Vernon Dahmer and many Blacks in the movement knew that any day they could walk around a corner and get shot. Someone could stab them, someone could run over them, someone could hit them with a bunch of bricks. A lot of things could happen, so that was in your mind. So whenever you were involved in a demonstration against racism, knowing that the only way Southern whites reacted to those demonstrations was through violence, you know that something was going to happen, but it was worth it to do what needed to be done to fight racism in this country then and now.
And what is your response to the now engagement of Axe Handle Saturday with people trying to learn more? And what do you think that we as citizens of Jacksonville and students at UNF can do to keep this history alive and let people know what happened?
Well, I think the first thing that we can do is teach it. We don't teach civil rights history. We don't teach Black history. We don't teach history. We don't understand the need to teach these things. University of North Florida needs to do more in recruiting Black faculty members, Black students at the university. You cannot hope and wish some things happen without being proactive about making them happen. You can't wish for more Black students at the University of North Florida, more Black faculty at the University of North Florida without recruiting them. You cannot wish and hope that Black history is taught in the Duval County Public Schools until you have an active program, even though it's being worked on, but it's not there now, and it could have been and should have been a long time ago.
And what advice do you have to us young emerging activists? I mean, how do we continue the fight that y'all started so long ago?
You're going to find a way. There is no formula that you mete out, just like Black Lives Matter and Dream Defenders and other movements came, and just like the Civil Rights Movement in the 50s and the 60s, all of these movements started with young Black folk. You saw an emerging Black leadership in the 50s and the 60s. When I first met Julian Bond and Marion Barry and John Lewis and Diane Nash and James Bevel, they were in their late teens. And many of your colleagues, many of your friends are in their teens or in their very early 20s. And if you like America as it is, then you don't do anything. Jane O'Neill, white female who calls herself an anti-racist, she's a former school teacher. She likes to talk to all white audiences, and there's a clip on YouTube, 45 seconds, where she asks her all white audience, how many of you here would like to be treated the same way blacks are treated in this country? No one raised their hand. She said, you did not understand me. I'm asking you, by a show of hands, how many of you would like to be treated the way black folks are treated in this country? No show of hands. She said, so you understand what I am saying. You understand the question that I am asking you, and what you are telling me back is that you don't want to be treated the way black folks are treated in this country. So my second question to you is, what are you going to do about it? So at the university, do you teach Black history on this university campus? Is there an active program to recruit Black students? What is the percentage of Black students on the University of North Florida's campus? What's the percentage of Black faculty? Why is it that the University of North Florida does not do anything north and west of the St. Johns River? If you're going to be a senior institution to do things all over this community, why is it, other than the Center for Urban Education and Policy, and I'm prejudiced toward the center, why is it no one else sees the need to take the message of what the University of North Florida is doing across the St. Johns River into the Black community? So there are a wealth of things that we can do. I went to work for a major Fortune 500 company, and before I went to work there a number of years ago, as the first Black male, they had a meeting with all of the men in the business. This was a business that hired hundreds of people, probably more than 1,200 people. And the vice president of the business of the company called all of the men together and told them to watch their language, which meant they knew that these Black males and these white males and other whites were using the term nigger as part of their vocabulary. We hear those terms on the campus. How many times has someone said to a person who used the term nigger, if you're going to use that, I don't want to hear it. I'm not going to be around you when you're hearing those words. Why do you have to hear it? We don't do that because that makes for an uncomfortable conversation. So we've got to understand that racism is uncomfortable, and we've got to deal with that and talk about it and talk about racism on college campuses, and we do not do it. White teachers are uncomfortable talking about it. Black professors on a campus are uncomfortable talking about it. And Black students, as little as they are certainly uncomfortable about it. And white students are uncomfortable about it, but we've got to talk about it.
Right. I wholeheartedly agree, and I'm sure everyone else listening in does. I just want to say thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for speaking with us. Just thank you for fighting the fight and just persevering. I mean, students that look like me, people that look like me across the world, I mean, we're just in awe of your courage. And what you said today really, really moved me at some points, and it moved me when I heard it spring semester. So just thank you. Just thank you for being here. Thank you for teaching this.
Thank you, Natalie, and I look forward to you being the future brain trust of this country.
Yes, that's all we can do.
Laura, can you switch over to me, please? I'm not sure how to get back on everyone's screen.
Yeah, we hear you now.
Okay, All right. Well, I just wanted to echo Natalie's gratitude and say thank you very much for participating with us and having this conversation with us today. We do encourage everyone to see the commemoration tomorrow, and so there is a website that that people can visit. Would you remind us of the website, please?
Yes, the website is axehandlesaturday.com, but WJXT is going to broadcast the commemoration live. The commemoration will also be on Facebook Live and also on YouTube Live. And there will be several other websites that will be announced in between now and tomorrow at noon.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you for sharing that information. I believe the commemoration, the first portion starts at noon tomorrow, so I do encourage everyone to go and visit that website and find those links that they need in order to virtually participate in that event. So thank you for being here today. I noted that there were upwards of 202 attendees today, so you have a message that we all needed to hear, and I'm so glad that it was so well attended. I hope that future sessions of the Justice Sessions will be equally well attended, and I thank everyone who has participated today. All right, be well.
Thank you.